Okay, try this again. This is my third attempt on this video, but having difficulty talking about Frank Zappa and Jordan Peterson, and it's quite a mishmash, so I had to eventually do a little spreadsheet on everything just so I can get things in order. Okay, so how this came about was there was a documentary on TV the other day about Jordan Peterson from 2018 called Shut Him Down, and it was mainly about the transgender issues, because I think he got fired or something from the university he was at because he didn't use the correct pronouns for transgender people. Before I get into that particular aspect, I just want to take a side trip over to the National Geographic issue from probably about the same time on transgender issue, and went into the science behind it. So I think it's important to just mention that there's three indicators or causes, I guess, of transgender according to science. And one is if the person's the gender of their hormones doesn't match the gender of the rest of their body. Another is if the gender of their chromosomes doesn't match the gender of the rest of their body. And the third is if when they're born, the doctor takes a look at the baby's genitals and can't quite figure out if he or she is looking at a penis or a vagina, and then makes an educated guess, which then later on turns out to be not correct. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But getting back to Jordan Peterson and the issue, he was mainly concerned about having to use different pronouns to when describing transgender people. And to a certain extent, I'm with him on that. Like the first time I read something by or about transgender person and they use the plural pronouns like they, them, their in place of singular pronouns, and it was just confusing as hell. And I thought, initially I thought, what am I reading here? Didn't an editor come through and fix this, the grammar up? Then I found out later that's what they want to use, which is crazy. Just to give you an example, there's an article on some poor kid who is transgender fairly recently, and probably early teens or something like that, and this kid was bullied so much at school by these three bullies that he or she committed suicide. So really horrific story. And so I read through it, and then I got to this one sentence where, you know, it was, they used the word their, them, whatever, and I read and reread that sentence several times, and I tried to get the context from the surrounding sentences, from the paragraph, and I still couldn't figure out where, if their or them referred to the kid who was being bullied or the three bullies who were bullying this poor kid. And so it's essentially butchering the English language. The crazy part is the transgender community already has these other pronouns, new pronouns that are available to use, like just like we have he, him, his, she, her, hers. there's this third set of pronouns, and I'm quite willing to learn 3 new words. You know, they're all single syllables, or not a big deal. So that's where I stand on it. Jordan Peterson, I'm not too sure where he stands exactly on that, but anyways, that was the gist of that documentary, and how he interacted or didn't interact with the whole transgender community. I'll come back to that a bit, I suppose, later on, but the other thing I want to talk about Jordan Peterson on was a YouTube video where he talked about, in his opinion, the 100 greatest books ever written. And so, again, there's some overlap between the books I think are important and the books he thinks are important. So the first one he talks about is the author Dostoevsky. And I read, this is my textbook in university back in 1985, when and I had to read Dostoevsky's book, Notes from Underground, and I say had to. It was a slog, and the description that the editor uses of the character in this book was despicable. You know, the character is despicable. So I started reading it again. Like I read it, 40 years ago, and this guy's crazy. And I started reading it again the other day. I couldn't get past the first page. So it was kind of like, reading plural pronouns from the transgender community. Life is too short. If this stuff is, and it's not important enough for me to read something that's either not about World War III or the Ukraine War or whatever, then I'm just going to leave it, right? But I think why Jordan Peterson chose Dostoevsky, and I'm reading the editor's comments on Dostoevsky, says, the tremendous stress on personal freedom of choice. So this is a big thing that Jordan Peterson is on about, is freedom, right? The freedom to say what you want, and that. So let's delve into that a bit more. The freedom quote. Oh God, I forgot my sheet of paper here. I'm gonna splice these two in. Okay, sorry about that. I left my quote sheet elsewhere. So this is one of the quotes from that documentary that on Jordan Peterson. So this is exactly what Jordan Peterson said. He's not in favor of people banding together in ideological groups. So that, I guess it introduces, certainly, I guess that introduces Solzhenitsyn. He's, one of his favorite books is The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn won the Nobel Prize for Literature. This is an abridged version of Gulag Archipelago. This is only 400 pages long, 400 some odd pages long. The unabridged version of Gulag Archipelago is probably closer to 2,000 pages. And I remember reading about half of those 2,000 pages when I was in my early 20s. So, and back then I got pretty worked up about, the lack of freedom under the Soviet society. So, I'm, really on board with Jordan Peterson for that choice of books from Solzhenitsyn. So 3 words, which hopefully will stick in your mind from that book. Boots on testicles, and that's an image from the Gulag Archipelago, the Soviet system, lack of freedom, and I talk a bit about it. I devote an entire section in one chapter in my book on Solzhenitsyn, and in here I mention that phrase, boots on testicles, actual boots, actual testicles. Anyways, I mentioned this book I wrote, but don't buy it. I mean, the lowest I could get it down to on Amazon was $40, but you can just go to my website and download the free PDF of it. And besides, the PDF gets updated on a more regular basis than the actual physical book does. So, where are we next? Okay, Orwell. George Orwell was another one of Jordan Peterson's favorites, and certainly a favorite of mine. I'll flash an image of my license plate, and so I've read all of George Orwell's fiction. I've read all of George Orwell's non-fiction. I've read Orwell's personal letters and diary entries. I've read what other people he was close to in his life, what they've said about him, ranging from his childhood sweetheart, like when he was elementary school, all the way up to the person who wound up writing his obituary in 1949 when he died. And also listened a couple times to an audio course, a university course on Orwell on MP3 player. And so, you could say I'm huge Orwell fan, along with Jordan Peterson. I think Jordan Peterson obviously emphasized this whole freedom thing, right? And of course, Orwell wrote 1984, An Animal Farm, which is all about Stalin and the Soviet Union and the lack of freedom there. I think what he misses is this balance between freedom and responsibility. And George Orwell didn't. George Orwell, if you read all of his stuff, you'll see that he was able to balance this notion of freedom and responsibility. I mean, he fought in the Spanish Civil War, and he got shot through the throat for it. And if that bullet had been like a fraction of an inch or a fraction of a millimeter, either way, 1984 and Animal Farm might never have been written. So when his military unit in the Spanish Civil War, I suppose people in the military can back me up on this, that it's not only freedoms, you have a lot of responsibility, right, to whichever nation you're fighting for, as well as your fellow people at arms. And then when World War II happened, a few years later, George Orwell, he had probably the early onset of tuberculosis, so he was rejected by the army, but he did have a unit. He was in charge of a unit of the Home Guard in Britain. So they were, helping firefighters when the Nazis were bombing London and whatnot, and all sorts of, like, helping people get to shelters, and they would also drill with rifles and stuff, because at the time they thought that a Nazi invasion of the British Isles was fairly imminent. So it was these units of the Home Guard were older men, usually rejected by the army just because of their age or maybe health or whatever, but they still wanted to be useful, right? So George, that's another aspect of responsibility. And of course, you look at the wider state of affairs at that time, and you compare Stalin with Churchill, right? And Stalin, the lessons we learn from Stalin are the importance of freedom, and whereas the lessons we learn from Churchill is the importance of responsibility. So again, it's that balance that we need. And then that always makes me think of Britain's at war during that time. Could Canadians, could North Americans have stuck together and accomplished what the British did when they were getting pounded by the Nazis on the home front? I don't know. I have my doubts. Like, the spirit of community is, I don't think, as strong as it was back in Britain in the 1940s. Which brings me to Frank Zappa. So whenever I think of freedom without responsibility, I always think of Frank Zappa's song Teenage Wind. And I will quote a bit here. I got to be free, free as the wind, free as the way I got to be. And it goes on, like, hilarious lyrics, and another bit here is, free is when you don't have to pay for nothing or do nothing. We want to be free, free as the wind. And of course, like all, not all, a lot of Frank Zappa's songs, quite humorous, and he was a perfectionist in his music, and so he knew that, like, the other time when I think of Frank Zappa was when he was on Saturday Night Live in 1978, and there was a skit he was on with John Belushi, Lorraine Newman, Dan Aykroyd, and those latter three, they were all hippies and just strung out, right, in this old castle. And Frank Zappa stumbles on this place because he's lost, and he's trying to find his way sort of back to civilization, and comes into this old castle, and these guys are all strung out on drugs, and so the whole theme of this skit was Frank Zappa doesn't do drugs, which he didn't, and with his band he ran a very tight ship because he was a perfectionist, and so Frank Zappa knew how to balance freedom and responsibility. So I'll go back to the ideological, or Jordan Peterson's quote again. He's not in favor of people banding together in ideological groups. So it makes me wonder, are there any ideologies that Jordan Peterson would like to promote? I guess freedom, would be one of them. Although, like I said, he doesn't seem to have that balance. One of the other, those 100 greatest books that he was listing, probably a good dozen or more of them were by Carl Jung. And Carl Jung is another one of my favorite authors. And Carl Jung wrote about the collective unconscious. And that ties in with spirituality and, I write down here, quantum entanglement. Albert Einstein called it spooky action at a distance because he thought it's just not possible. But science has now proven that quantum entanglement or spooky action at a distance is in fact a real phenomenon. And again, I write about it in my book here, and so have a look at that. But be easier, just Google quantum entanglement. And what really blew my mind the other day, like I thought it was all at the subatomic level, this stuff, and it essentially says that communication across vast distances faster than the speed of light is possible, which lends credence to things like ESP, spirituality, you name it. So yeah, please have a look. What blew my mind the other day though was I Googled it myself, and it, like I knew it talked about stuff at the subatomic level, but it's also been proven at the molecular level, and even at the level they mentioned small diamonds. So it must have been, somehow the vibration of the crystals in a diamond permits this sort of again what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. So that's an area that I feel comfortable promoting as an ideology, and I assume that Jordan Peterson does also, because he talks about Carl Jung and collective unconscious and those sorts of things. What Jordan Peterson leaves out though, and again it gets back to this balance of freedom and responsibility, it leaves out this whole discussion of community, and community is where we see and feel the need for responsibility, right? And I've talked about this fellow before, Alexis de Tocqueville, and I'm sure if you went to any political science class and asked what the top 10 books were in political science, Tocqueville would be right at the top there. And that relates, this Habits of the Heart, this was the book in the early 1990s that kind of really introduced me to the importance of community when I was in university. And then that led into this Bowling Alone book, and I mentioned this in another one of my videos. And where community, it has been shown that community is not only correlated with economic prosperity, but community helps to engender, promote economic prosperity. So we really need to keep that in mind. So Jordan Peterson as a person, like, getting back to this documentary, in one part of the documentary, he meets up with this other professor by the name of Jonathan Haidt, and they go to one of the universities, and they see a sign on the wall that encourages students to, if they see something that's not woke enough, to report it to the officials, right? And so they both agree that, this is crazy. This is getting really crazy. And the thing is, Jonathan Haidt, I first saw him interviewed on Firing Line by Margaret Hoover, and the other fellow on Firing Line interviewed by Margaret Hoover was John McWhorter, and I mentioned McWhorter in another video, so I encourage you to look at that. But both Jonathan Haidt and John McWhorter and Jordan Peterson, they're all warning against the extremists on the left, and where woke ideology gets a bit too far, and it has a tendency to tear society apart. The difference, though, between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Haidt and John McWhorter is Jordan Peterson, to my way of thinking, is a bit too abrasive. Whereas when I'm watching Jonathan Haidt and John McWhorter on being interviewed by Margaret Hoover on Firing Line, they come across as friendly. They come across as people who can appreciate constructive criticism from the other side. They come across as people who, well, you see them chuckle, you see them smile, you see them laugh, right? Whereas I don't recall ever seeing Jordan Peterson chuckle or laugh. So there's that something about Peterson. He's just a little bit too abrasive. And getting back to that, his fight against the trans community, I think it would have been better for all concerned if he sought out someone in the trans community who was not ultra woke, and they just sat down and chatted, right? That would have been much better. Getting back to Firing Line and Margaret Hoover, I used to watch Firing Line back in the 80s when William F. Buckley was the host. And so I will say Margaret Hoover is a lot easier on the eyes than William F. Buckley. You'll see what I mean if you check their shows. Now, that, I guess, was a sexist comment, and the reason I bring it up is because Jordan Peterson, in the video, he also makes a sexist comment, but he justifies it because the comment was true, and I can justify my comment because, Margaret Hoover is a lot easier on the eyes than William F. Buckley, at least to a heterosexual male, and that ties in with Frank Zappa as well. Like, Frank Zappa is not afraid to say things that are not politically correct if they're true, right? He's not afraid to say things which might offend some people. I don't know how abrasive he is. Apparently on Saturday Night Live, there was a bit of he didn't get along well with some of the cast or the writers. I'm not too sure whose fault that was, but anyways, I guess at the end of the day, if you're saying stuff that's true, you have to do it in a manner that takes the other person's feelings into account, and you also have to do it where there's not, a vast mob of people that are just ready to get riled up, and that kind of happens a bit with Jordan Peterson, and it also happens with the trans group on campus that he was up against. And if you see the video, it's just not very encouraging. But anyways, there you go. Frank Zappa, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Haidt, John McWhorter, Margaret Hoover, and William F. Buckley. Okay, that's it. Thanks.